Friday was a still, windless day, and that evening an even larger throng pressed around the balloon to watch the belated ascension of Eva. Around 6 p.m., Chubby Miller went into his act, consulted his gold watch, had Eva publicly absolve the Walter C. Miller shows from all liability, consulted the sleepy circus touts, judiciously poked the sides of the flabby balloon, held up his moistened finger to test the wind. He even added a barometer to the act. In the meantime, the gleeful concessionaires busily ladled out their colorful gimcracks. There was a bad moment when Chubby finally declared that the balloon would not go up, that the show would have to be held over for still another day. No, it wasn't the wind tonight, it was simply a lack of hot air. He was awfully afraid they'd sprung a leak in their balloon. He'd have his special imported balloon seamstress go over the bag tomorrow with a fine-tooth comb. And oh yes, little Eva would give a midnight performance for men only. A high look. When Chubby finished his announcement, there was an involuntary surge toward the platform and the balloon by the miners in the crowd. Here they'd lost 2 days' wages in the mines, and still the bloody balloon hadn't gone up. One shouting miner waggishly suggested that Chubby simply talk into the balloon if it needed hot air. The tense situation was saved when the circus band suddenly appeared on the scene and struck up a tune. Little Eva went into a sinuous dance and held the thralled miners at bay. That night her midnight show was jammed. Danny met little Eva and Chubby later that night at an informal reception down at Big Annie's. To ensure privacy, Annie graciously barred the doors against the riff and the raff, as she called them. Her graciousness was short-lived, however. She glowered jealously as she watched Danny extend himself to amuse little Eva. Danny was in fine fettle. He sang songs to Eva, he told her droll stories, and he even did a lumberjack dance to the accompaniment of Annie's gramophone. Eva laughed gaily and fluttered her eyelashes. Yep, Danny said, and launched into another story. When Chubby hilariously suggested that Danny join the show and travel with them, Annie excused herself and crept to her lonely bed and wept. Danny finally taxied Eva and Chubby back to the showgrounds in Rocco Pantalone's old Cadillac. It was dawn. The third day, Saturday, was another beautiful day with just a slight east wind, perfect for ballooning, and the crowd gathered early. Especially the miners. They began appearing singly and in pairs as early as 3 o'clock. Chubby grew sore perplexed as he nervously peered out from the flaps of his office tent. Who were all these men soberly toting old railroad ties, empty wooden dynamite boxes, lengths of hematite-stained cedar lagging? What were they up to? The Lord save us, there came a man carrying an old wooden baby crib. What in the world were these yokels planning to do with all that wood? What in the world, indeed? For some odd reason, Chubby came to the platform at 6 p.m., flanked by a half-dozen odd circus roustabouts. The roustabouts proceeded to lean around nonchalantly on unemployed tent stakes, looking bored. Little Eva blinked her blue eyes even more tremulously as she surveyed the sea of grim male faces in front of her. There were no smiles when Chubby went into his familiar act. There was a stony silence when, accompanied by his 6 roustabouts, he retired from the platform to confer with the balloon attendants. He spent an unaccountably long time jabbing and poking at the flabby balloon and whispering to the attendants. In fact, he looked as though he were contemplating a sudden trip of his own. Finally, he returned to the platform, followed closely by his bodyguards. It was a pale and wan Chubby that finally faced the throng. He did not have to hold up his hand for silence as he gulped and wet his lips and launched into his familiar cancellation speech. It was one which the miners had now learned by heart. "Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen," he began. Alas, he did not get any farther. A dozen miners leapt up on the platform, led by Big Tom Treblecock of the Cambria mine. The miners advanced slowly upon Chubby, carrying strange walking sticks consisting of assorted drill cores, coupling bolts, pick handles, and the like. After one appraising look, the roustabouts silently melted from the platform. Chubby and little Eva were left alone to face the delegation of determined miners. Tom Treblecock was the first to speak. "Mr. Miller," he respectfully demanded, "didn't your circus play last week at Calumet up on the Copper Range?" What's it to you?" Chubby blustered. "Get off'n this platform. I'll call an officer. Yes, we showed in Calumet." "And did little Eva and her balloon go up over Calumet?" the big miner pressed on. Of course they did," Chubby sputtered. Why, I'll call an officer." At this juncture, a strange miner vaulted up on the platform. Tom Treblecock turned to the newcomer. "Tell the boys, Jack," Tom said. "Tell 'em what really happened up in the copper country." The newcomer faced the silent crowd. "Boys," he began quietly, "I'm Jack Beaufort, a copper miner from the Quincy mine up at Calumet. Boys, as true as I'm standing here," Jack pointed at the sagging balloon, "that bloody balloon there never rose an inch off'n the ground in Calumet. It happened there exactly same as it's happened here. We lost all 3 shifts at the mine, and no balloon never went up. Boys," Jack concluded, "I'm afeard this hull bloomin' balloon business is a bloody fake." There was an angry rumble from the crowd as Tom Treblecock turned to little Eva. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, "but will you go gettin' the balloon nice and quiet, or must we carry you there?" Little Eva glanced at horrified Chubby, and Chubby stared wildly back at Eva. Finally, she courageously bowed her blonde head and murmured, "I'll go." There was a prolonged cheer from the crowd, which neither heard nor heeded Chubby's wild "No, no," as he rushed over to save Eva. The crowd howled and roared its approval when several miners roughly seized chattering Chubby and tied him to the bars of the nearby lion's cage. The lion frowned, wrinkled up his nose like a polecat eatin' bumblebees, Buller later declared, and retreated to the rear of his cage. Chubby's misery was complete. Little Eva clung quietly to the ropes of her wicker basket. She maintained the calm of Joan of Arc at the stake as 100-odd miners descended upon the balloon with their firewood, shouldering aside the frightened attendants. Soon there was a wildly leaping fire under the swelling balloon. The crowd cheered and sang, "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight." Lo, the balloon was fattening prodigiously before their very eyes. In a few minutes 1,000 willing hands were needed to hold the swollen bag to earth. Gleaming hunting knives appeared in the hands of other miners. Finally, the last sandbag was cut from the straining balloon. All was in readiness. Big Tom Treblecock held up his hand to give the signal. "Are you ready, little Eva?" he inquired respectfully.
Yes,"
Eva replied faintly. "Wait!" someone shouted. There was an amazed "ah" from the crowd as an old man suddenly darted from the throng, raced up to the wicker basket, and standing on tiptoe threw his arms about little Eva, vainly straining to lift her from the basket. Eva threw her arms wildly around her would-be savior, clinging to him like one who was drowning.
"Danny, Danny!"
she shrilled, clutching him to her even more tightly. "Get back, old man!" Tom Treblecock grimly shouted at Danny. "I'll give you 3. "Better start counting, mister," Danny chirped blissfully. 1, Tom announced as Danny started to clamber into the wicker basket. 2, Tom called as Danny got one leg over the edge of the basket. 3, Tom shouted, bringing down his arm. With a great whish and rush, the straining balloon shot up into the air, the basket swaying precariously. The crowd cheered, Chubby squealed, the lion roared. Up, up, soared the balloon. Soon it was a mere dot in the sky. When last seen, Danny's dangling leg was just disappearing over the edge of the wicker basket. Some witnesses later declared they saw the fluttering of a red bandana handkerchief as the balloon majestically sailed westward and disappeared into the sunset. 3 days later, the state constabulary discovered Danny and Eva dwelling in blissful contentment at Mackey's tourist cabins at Nestoria. "What was it like?" the young reporter from the Hematite Weekly asked Danny, pushing his way through the cheering crowd that gathered to greet the balloonists upon their triumphal return to Chippewa. "What was it like?" the reporter repeated, holding his pencil importantly poised. The welcoming throng fell silent, awaiting Danny's verdict. Danny shot an adoring look at little Eva. "Well, now, young feller, just tell the folks it was plain heaven," he declared. Yep. In fact, it's the closest I've ever been to heaven in my whole life, and I'm damn sure it's the closest I'll ever get to there when I'm dead. Yep. You can also tell 'em I sorta kinda offered Miss Eva my hand in marriage. But it looks like they's still a couple of husbands standing between me and Eva at the altar. So I guess Danny'll stay single yet for a while. Yep. Say, has anybody here got a drink? Number 11. The Side Hill Gouger. The next visitors at Hungry Hollow arrived unheralded. They simply drove up in front of the camp one August afternoon in a little blue roadster bearing Illinois license plates. Danny was alone in camp. He moved to the door and looked out. The visitors were a bespectacled young man and a girl. The two sat in the car looking around uncertainly. Bessie strode up from the river and sniffed the hot radiator. It was not good eating. "Moo!" she bawled. The young couple clutched at each other and stared at Bessie. "Come on out," Danny called out. "Old Bess won't hurt you." Somewhat dubiously, the young woman alighted from the car and hurried up the trail toward Danny. She was clad in a pullover sweater and jodhpurs. She had a colorful scarf tied about her head, peasant fashion. Her eyes were wide and brown, and she had deep dimples. She smiled sweetly at Danny. "You lost, little girl?" Danny asked.
"No, I don't think so," she replied, smiling. "My husband and I are looking for Mr. McGinnis's home at Hungry Hollow. The proprietor of Charlie's place in Chippewa drew us this crude road map. He was so droll about it. This should be it. Are you Mr. McGinnis?"
"Your husband?" Danny exclaimed incredulously. "Why, I thought— Yes, I'm Danny McGinnis."
"I'm Carol Andrews of Evanston," she smiled. "You see, Bruce, my husband, and I are on our honeymoon. We came to stay with you for a week, if we may. We saw your ad in one of the Chicago papers this spring, and we saved it. It was so very droll."
"Drool?" Danny said, bridling.
"No, no," the young bride laughed. "Droll, amusing, clever."
Danny could readily see that this discerning young lady had a head on her shoulders. That was the kind of people to have around, folks that knew a real droll when they saw him. He walked around the front of the camp and proudly pointed at the trim new log cabin which stood on the birch ridge. "That there's our new tourist camp, ma'am. Me and the boys just finished it last week. We'd be mighty glad to have you stay with us, ma'am."
"Oh, you don't live alone?" Carol said, widening her expressive dark eyes.
"No, ma'am. There's Buller and Timmy and Swan and Taconite lives here with me," Danny said.
"How utterly droll! Snow White and the Five Dwarfs. Brucey will be terribly fascinated," Carol said. "You know he's working on his master's."
"Workin' on his master's what, ma'am?" Danny respectfully inquired.
Carol laughed her trilling little girl laugh. "Of course, how silly of me. Brucey's working on his master's degree in biology. You see, we both attend school at Evanston. Brucey's in graduate school, of course. He's majoring in vertebrate ecology."
"Oh," Danny said. He pondered this intelligence for a moment. "Well, maybe you better tell the Major to fetch up your suitcases."
"Lammy, dear," Carol called down to her husband, who still sat stolidly staring at Bessie, "you'd better bring our things up. This is going to be simply priceless, darling. I feel it in my bones."
Brucey dubiously disengaged his lanky 6 feet some odd from the little roadster and stood blinking at Bessie through his horn-rimmed glasses. "Moo!" Bessie bawled, arching her head as Brucey hurriedly clambered back into the car. "Lammy," Danny muttered, leading the way up the ridge to Hungry Hollow's virgin tourist cabin. Carol came tripping down to the main camp the next morning, bright and early. Danny, frying the breakfast bacon, introduced the other boys. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," ran around the room. Smiling Swan had got up at daybreak and carefully shaved and anointed himself, putting on his best blue serge suit. His scented blonde hair was parted and smacked down like a movie villain's.
"Mr. McGinnis," Carol began uncertainly, "I don't like to complain, but there's a live mouse swimming around in our water pail."
She paused, her dark eyes wide and pleading. "Yep, ain't it queer how the little devils like the water pail?" Danny amiably agreed.
"Should we throw the pail of water out, Mr. McGinnis?" Carol said.
"No, just throw the mouse out," Danny said, expertly turning the bacon.
"Oh, I simply couldn't do that," Carol shrilled.
"Then let the Major do it," Danny said.
But Brucie's still asleep. He read so late last night."
"Read?" Danny exclaimed, horrified. It was abundantly plain from his expression what he thought of the future security of a nation whose young majors stooped to reading a goddamn book on their honeymoons. "Timmy," Danny said, "you go on up and tend to the Major's mouse." Carol and gentle little Timmy got along famously after that. He immediately became her favorite dwarf. After breakfast, Whistling Timmy got his canoe down from the rafters of Bessie's woodshed and carried it down to the pool. "What were you up to, Tommy?" Swan inquired suspiciously when Timmy returned to the camp. "Oh," Timmy replied casually, "me and Carol's going upstream in the canoe." "What for you going upstream?" Swan went on doggedly. Timmy walked over and regarded the envious Swan scornfully. "To spawn, of course, you bloody lunkhead," Bristling Timmy answered with a fine and withering sarcasm. All right, Buller said, pushing between them and spinning both of them back a dozen feet. "How the hell you spec we can keep any tourists if you bloody mopes is going to start fighting over 'em?" Carol appeared in the doorway.
"I'm all ready, Timmy," she called sweetly. "Brucie's sitting up now, reading in bed."
As Carol and Timmy went down the river trail, Swan began mussing his hair until he looked like one of the desperate before ads of the tonic preparations. Irate and disheveled, the spurned swain slipped off his blue serge suit and wearily grabbed up his old clothes. "Come now, Taconite," Swan said. "We will go and cut some wood. That were our speed around this here lady's seminary." "Lammy," Danny muttered dolefully, staring out the open door. While Carol and Timmy were out canoeing, lanky Brucie so far bestirred himself as actually to get out of bed, dress, and saunter languidly down to the main camp. He was obliged to stoop under the camp doorway as he entered. Danny and Buller were playing cribbage with the aid of the last bottle of Chicago whiskey, which stood open on the table before them. "And a pair are 6, Buller counted, pegging his hand. "Pardon me," Brucie said in measured accents. He peered at them through his horn-rimmed glasses, his pale eyes staring and magnified through the thick lenses. "Oh," Danny said, looking up, "if it ain't the Major hisself. Did you finally get tired of reading? Here, have a snort. It might be good for what ails you." Danny pushed the bottle along the oilcloth cover. 7-year-old stuff. Made it myself last night. Have a snort."
"Snort?" Brucie repeated, savoring the word. "What's a snort?"
His scientific curiosity was aroused. He looked almost eager. Danny and Buller glanced at each other. Danny said. "A snort. Let's see. A snort's 3 fingers of the hair of the dog what chased the cat, what clawed the rat, what played ta-ra-ra-boom-de-ay." It was Danny's turn to be precise. "Do you want a slug of whiskey, mister, or do you not want a slug of whiskey?"
"Oh,"
Brucie said, smiling faintly.
No, thanks. What I came to ask you about is where Mrs. Andrews and I might go to observe some of the wildlife of the North Woods. It just occurred to me that this is our second day here, and we haven't seen any indigenous fauna." "Did you say seen or had?" Danny asked. Brucey almost broke into a grin. "Bully," he said. "Very good indeed." Then his thin face grew serious again. "We'd really like to absorb more of your local atmosphere. Best of all, we'd like to see some wild animals, if we could." He turned to leave. "I'd greatly appreciate it if you would arrange it." It was not strictly a request. Brucey strode to the door. "Pardon the intrusion, gentlemen," he said, ducking out under the doorway. "Run down to the river, Buller, and turn on the wild animals," Danny whispered. Danny and Buller had themselves two rapid snorts. "Do we really have to put up with that there spook for a whole week?" Buller mused aloud. Their interest in the cribbage game had palled. "And here's Timmy and Swan at swords' points over the little lady," Danny said. "Not that I blame 'em," he added wistfully. They sat lost in thought. "Moo!" came the bawling of Bessie outside as she spied Brucey striding back to his cabin. Danny said thoughtfully. He had himself another snort. Suddenly he slapped his leg. Buller looked at him inquiringly. "Mr. Bodine," Danny said, enunciating carefully, "pardon the intrusion, sir, but could you manage to meet me behind Bessie's domicile tonight at midnight? It just occurred to me, sir, that if our lammy pie won't stir from his shack long enough to see any atmospheric North Woods animals, perhaps we'd better arrange to fetch him up to him. Paying guests, you know. It's just a droll idea what come to me kind of sudden like, is all." Buller gravely nodded his head. "Mr. McGinnis," he said, "the idlest passin' whim of our guests is a bloody command, sir. Mr. Bodine allows he would be delighted to join Mr. McGinnis tonight behind Bessie's woodshed." Buller smiled and fluttered his eyelids girlishly. "Goddamn delighted," he added. He glanced toward the open door. "Shh! Here comes Timmy and the girl back from their spawning tour." At midnight, Danny arose and stealthily shook Buller awake. The two dressed quickly and quietly stole from their snoring comrades. Outside, the moon sailed high from out behind a jagged cliff of cloud. Danny and Buller hurried over to Bessie's barn through the dewy grass and ferns. "You take and lead Bessie," Danny commanded Buller in a sharp whisper, "and I'll fetch the rest of the equipment." In a few seconds, a strange procession filed up the moonlit trail to the tourist camp, Buller half pulling and half dragging sleepy Bessie, who placidly continued to chew her cud. Then Danny padding along carrying a saw, a piece of cedar board, an auger, and, of all things, a cake of livestock salt. Arriving at the darkened tourist camp, the three carefully made their way behind the camp and out of the path of the moonlight. Danny held up a warning finger for silence. No sounds came from the tourist camp. All was hushed save the chirping of the crickets and the shrill piping of the frogs down by the river. From far away came the plaintive call of a whippoorwill. Danny nodded his head and quickly hung the cake of salt from a nail on the side of the camp. Bessie spotted the salt and immediately made for it, eagerly running her rasping tongue over the block of salt.
Soon the wet sounds of vast salivary gulpings and lappings and swallowings filled the summer air. Danny thrust the cedar board and the saw at Buller, and as Buller noisily sawed the board, Danny took the auger and drilled a series of holes in the logs of the camp. Even Bessie was astounded over this strange nocturnal behavior. She paused in her salty feast to stare at the two. Still perplexed, she opened her mouth to give vent to a questioning moo. Buller quickly clamped both of his hands over Bessie's mouth, just as Danny lunged over and bunted her in the belly with his knee. The result was not like any sound ever emitted by a cow, a vast intestinal rumbling, ending in an abruptly strangled belch. Then all was silence. Danny and Buller and Bessie waited in the shadows behind the camp until the moon disappeared behind a cloud. Then the two men rushed Bessie down to her barn and secured her in her stall and put their tools away. Danny gave her the rest of the cake of salt for her reward. "Moo," she softly lowed. Danny and Buller then ran back up the trail toward the tourist camp, Danny brandishing a pitchfork and Buller a shovel. They ran behind the camp, flailing the ground with their weapons, shouting in a curiously restrained way, "Scat, you insane divil! Get away from this here now camp! Look out, Buller, the monster's making for to charge you!" Gradually their voices grew fainter as Danny and Buller valiantly forced their imaginary adversary deeper into the midnight forest. Nothing stirred in the tourist camp. Peace descended at last upon Hungry Hollow. It was but little past daybreak the next morning when the white-faced bride of Hungry Hollow came running down to the main camp. She was wearing a sort of kimono which flew out behind her as she ran. Danny intercepted her at Bessie's woodshed. "Psst!" Spying Danny, she ran into his arms, nearly sobbing. "Oh, Mr. McGinnis," she began. "Shh!" Danny whispered, a warning finger over his lips. "Don't tell me. I know what you heard last night. Thank goodness me and Buller heard it too. Though it most scared us clean out of our nightshirts, we went out and drove him off. But don't tell the other boys about it," Danny warned darkly. "If they knowed them awful things was back again, they'd up and desert us sure and leave us here to protect ourselves alone." "What awful things?" Carol whispered hoarsely. "Shh!" Danny whispered. "You wait till the other boys is gone, after breakfast, and then Buller and me'll tell you all about it." Danny the Comforter patted Carol's shoulder. She managed to smile up at him wanly. "If it weren't for the perfectly horrible sounds the thing made, I'd have sworn that in the darkness it looked just like Bessie the cow," she whispered. Danny blinked his eyes and swallowed. He was equal to the occasion. "That's exactly what I thought the first one I run across. The reason they look something like a cow's, because they's most as big as one. But Bessie's been locked up the whole night, thank goodness. See the latch on her door? Now you run back to your great big Lammy, and he'll console you." Carol's eyes flashed darkly. "Lammy, my foot," she said. Then she was nearly in tears over her disloyal thoughts. Brucey hasn't stirred from under the bedclothes all night. Oh, I wish my mother were here." After breakfast, taconite and smoldering swan left for their beloved wood-cutting. Danny craftily dispatched willing Timmy down to the river to catch a few fresh trout for Carol. Grabbing his fly-rod, Timmy went blithely whistling on his way. He'd scale a mountain for little Carol. The coast was clear. Danny and Buller met breathless Carol at the camp door.
"What was it? What was it?" Carol exclaimed. "I've just got to know. Brucey's gone frantically through all his books, and he simply can't make it out. Especially that grating, sawing noise."
Danny looked at Buller significantly. "See, we weren't a minute too soon last night," he said in an awed voice. "The critter'd already started his awful drillin'." He turned to Carol. "Sit down, ma'am," he said gravely. "This is going to be hard to take. Just try to calm yourself while we explain about this here thing."
"What thing?"
Carol whispered. Danny took a deep breath. "The plain fact of the matter, ma'am, is one of them terrible side-hill gougers is back again." Danny shook his head. "Buller and me'll have to set up tonight and lay for him with flares and the old 44. That's if we can keep awake after all the ruction last night." Danny stifled a yawn. "They usually allus come back to the very same place the next night when they're driven off that way. Awful stubborn critters they are." Danny wagged his head dolefully. Yep, the side-hill gougers is back again."
"Side-hill gougers?" Carol said, her eyes dilating. "What are they?"
"You mean you ain't never heard tell of the side-hill gouger?" incredulous Danny demanded.
"No,"
Carol confessed in a small voice. Danny wanted to be perfectly fair. "Well, it's true they's only natives of the Upper Peninsula, and I guess there ain't many folks has ever really laid eyes on 'em," he conceded. "You see, ma'am, they perform most of their deviltry late at night. Generally at the stroke of midnight they come groaning and moaning out of their lairs in the hills."
"Hills?"
Carol exclaimed. "Yes, ma'am," Danny went on quietly. "You see, the full-grown side-hill gouger's most as big as a bear, 'cept he's terrible nearsighted and he can't climb worth a tinker's... Well, he's awful poor at climbing. Seems like the critters is all got high blood pressure, and climbing makes 'em dizzy. Anyway, when one of 'em comes onto a hill or a stump or anything in his way, he jest naturally bores and drills his way plumb through it. And the more he drills, the madder he gets." Danny shook his head. "It's an awful sight to view the slashing and rooting left in the wake of a real mad side-hill gouger." Danny blinked his gray eyes reflectively, sadly recollecting past ruination. "It's horrible and torrible, ma'am."
You mean they'll go right through any obstruction? Even a log cabin?"
Carol whispered. "Log cabins," Danny exclaimed. "They's specially fond of cabins, ma'am. I mind the time one of 'em drilled clean through Billy Grill's bunk up to his camp on the Connors Creek. You couldn't find a piece left as big as a toothpick. Lucky for Billy he weren't in it. Many's the time we've had to drive 'em off right here with pitchforks and cant hooks. Ain't that right, Buller?" "You bet," Buller solemnly avowed. "Sometimes even with hot coals, ma'am. 'Member that time, Dan? I had to take 'n..." Yep. Danny was not going to yield the floor to Buller's hot coals. "It was awful bad here for a spell. They ain't been near so ornery of late years," he ran on. "We thought mebbe they'd all finally drilled their way clear through to the other side of the Mulligan Mountains." Danny sorrowfully shook his head again. "But it looks like we're in for it again." "But how do they do it?" Carol said. "It seems incredible." It was a fair question. "That we don't rightly know, ma'am," he went on. Danny was as perplexed as Carol. "To tell you the truth, we ain't never really kilt one, or even seen one of 'em close up in daylight. You see, travelin' only by night that way, they's even harder to assassinate than the 5-footed swamp grizzle." "Swamp grizzles?" Carol echoed in dismay. "What are they?" Buller was suddenly seized with a choking spell and hurried from the camp. "The 5-footed swamp grizzle?" Danny repeated slowly, his eyes widening. He ran his tongue over his lips. "Well, never you mind about them right now, ma'am. We slew the sole survivor of them devils jest last fall. But getting back to the side-hill gouger and as how he does his drillin', we know from his tracks he's got terrible big, powerful webbed feet with claws on 'em like a spring-tooth harrow. That time when Buller thrun the hot coals, he got a pretty good squint at one. It was an awful sight. Poor Buller had nightmares for weeks." "What did it look like?" Carol breathed, morbidly fascinated. "Well, I can only tell you what I heard tell from Buller, but Buller swore up and down later that the critter's big drippin' snout looked jest like a post-hole digger, but sort of rigged out with long, sharp, rotatin' teeth. And he claims the slaverin' critter's head had openings in the sides, just like big gills. I suppose them gills is to let the gravel and stuff out of when he's got a big job of drillin' to do. Of course, that's just my own personal guess, mind." A long shadow filled the camp doorway. "Oh, Brucey!" Carol cried, running over and wildly throwing her arms about her husband. "I've just found out what was making those awful sounds last night. Oh, we're lucky to be alive." Brucey slowly blinked his eyes. "Let's be both objective and coherent, dear," he said in his precise voice. "Now tell me about it, dispassionately and lucidly." No, I can't, Lammy," Carol wailed, clutching him more tightly. "Ask Mr. McGinnis what it is. He's practically seen one. They only come out at midnight." Brucey turned and regarded old Dan owlishly, but Danny had suddenly grown very weary of the side-hill gouger. "Sorry, folks, I gotta go down and get some fresh water," he said, grabbing up the pails and clanging them out of the camp and down the river trail. Buller was sitting outside on the sawbuck chewing a straw.